Let me do a quick introduction, and then I'm going to turn the mic over to you. So Calvin Croll is the head coach at Future Water Paddlesports, LLC. Since 2001, he's been engaged in different outdoor education pursuits. In the past 20 years, he's worked for university outdoor programs, multiple outward bound wilderness schools across the country, and spent count them, 2 years coaching paddle sports full-time for Body Boat Blade when it was located on Orcas Islands. In January of 2018, Calvin set out to try and become the first person to circumnavigate Vancouver Island by sea kayak in the winter. What could possibly go wrong? The journey ended successfully after snow, rain, record-breaking wave heights, and a January transit of the west coast of the island. So, without any further ado, Calvin, tell us more about this harrowing journey through the winter in a kayak. It's all yours.
Sure. I just wanted to say hi and thanks for having me come for this meeting. Actually, this has been 2 years since I first got invited to give this talk to Oops back in the before times when I was going to come in person to Oregon for a general meeting. So Mark and Michael have doggedly stayed on scheduling people to keep interesting things for the meetings happening. So I really appreciate you all for making that happen still after 2 years. That's pretty impressive. So thanks for that. I'm gonna put up a set of slides and kind of talk through a presentation, but if people have questions, my understanding is someone's gonna monitor the chat and might be able to break in and stop me if you wanna, ask something as we go along. And that's fine.
Yeah, I'll monitor the chat and I'll let you know if there's any questions.
Thanks, Mark. That'll be great. So I'll just go through the, let me just get my screen up here. Great. So at any rate, I've been sea kayaking for a good bit now. I first started in 2003, and really the reason why I love sea kayaking is being able to go on long trips. I just love the feeling of putting everything into a little boat and then going off for weeks at a time into the wilderness. I've done a lot of canoe tripping as well, but the sea is just really special to me, and I love it. And so this idea had come up one summer while I was working at Body Boat Blade, and they said, "Oh, a lot of folks had paddled around Vancouver Island." And they said, "Well, when are you going to do it?" And I said, "Well, I'm so busy all summer with coaching classes. I'll probably have to do it in the winter." And it was a joke. It kind of started as a joke at the bar, and then I started thinking about it more, and so where I live currently is Orcas Island. So kind of in the lower right, the San Juan Islands there, which I imagine some of you are very familiar with. And so I thought, well, this will be really interesting to just leave from home and come back to home and try to circumnavigate the island. And when I first started talking about doing it in the winter, I got varied reactions. Some people said, "You're nuts. Why in the world would you do that?" And then, some people kind of cheered me on. And then a few people were like, "Hey, what's the plan? What are you going to do?" And so I started looking into it. And with this presentation, I kind of want to share some of the process I went through in planning a big trip. And I hope that that's interesting and helpful to folks who might want to do something like this of their own in terms of, an extended trip or maybe a trip to a new area, and just thinking about how do you take on that kind of challenge. So yeah, this is the trip. I started looking into it. First, I did, consult the internet and see if there's anything out there. I found this blog of a fellow who tried to do this trip in 2008. And he went up the Inside Passage, and because of a shoulder injury, was not able to complete the trip. And I heard kind of whispers and rumors through paddling circles of other people that might have tried. And I thought, okay, this seems to be tough, and it seems to be that it hasn't been done. There's probably a good reason for that. So I started looking into it. I have some thoughts on, through my time, both at Outward Bound, leading long wilderness trips, and then also from my own personal expeditions on what makes a successful expedition. And the first thing I think of is that really you have to consider the details when you're taking on a very challenging endeavor. So I started pulling all those details together. Just in general, the trip's about 700 nautical miles, depending on, how many bays you cut across or how many coastlines you follow along the way. So I started poring over the charts. What does this territory actually look like? And then I also started reading a lot of books on meteorology, because I realized that this is going to be very different weather than when most people do the trip. Most folks circumnavigate this island in July or August or June. And that's just a very different weather system that dominates coming off the Pacific at that time. And I'm really glad, I'll come back to this later, but I'm really glad I learned a lot about weather because it was crucial to my success later. So I started looking at all kinds of details. I was looking at, what's the temperature and how many hours of daylight is there going to be, and how much cloud cover, and how much precipitation, and where's the wind speed and the direction, and what's the swell typically like. And I tried to condense it all. I figured it out and could put it into this one highly technical overview chart right here. So really, when it gets down to it, it's what you might expect with this island. One side's open to the Pacific. You got huge potential for swell coming in. On the inside passage, it's pretty well known for the very strong currents, and also, given the time of years, some pretty stiff and cold winds coming in off of the Coast Range in Canada. And so it seemed like it would be tough. It seemed like it was going to be tough on both sides of the island for different reasons. And so I was kind of left with the question of, well, which way do I go? I'm starting down there in the bottom right. What do you do first? Where do you go? And so I kind of relied on my second principle, which is, okay, so there's some challenges here, there's some problems, but I want to focus on the solution to them. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, if I go up the inside, I've got some more time. I can kind of get used to all my systems and the temperatures and everything. But boy, I don't know. By the time I get up to make that turn to go to the outside to the Pacific, that could really be built up psychologically of how much anxiety or worry I have about what's it going to be like when I get out to the big stuff. On the other hand, if I go right out to the coast, I might have some tailwinds as I head up there, because you have these predominant southeasterly winds in the winter as fronts come through. But oh boy, just going straight out into it, that could be tough too. In the end, I decided to go up the coast and to start off and kind of do a clockwise circumnavigation of the island. And I said, okay, well, I need to figure all this out and what it's going to be like. So I got to work in October and November in the San Juans. You might have noticed some spray coming off the waves there. Here in the winter, we get the fronts that come through as well. And we get a lot of wind-driven waves, big enough to have some nice downwind runs and get some surfs in. So I really sought out those days. I paddled as much as I could, especially if it was going to be blowing. I did a lot of runs where I paddled upwind for miles and then took the run downwind to see what it'd be like to control my boat in rough seas and surfing once I was already pretty exhausted. I sought out the days when it was just bitter cold. If it was in the 30s and blowing, then I made myself get out there and get my kayak just to, see what it was like, but also to test out my gear. Is this mitten going to be warm enough? Is my headgear going to be warm enough? What does it feel like after a few hours? Just really sorting out all those details and putting everything to the test before I really went out on the expedition for real. The other thing I did was I practiced a lot of self-rescues in full gear, all the stuff that I would be wearing, because I was planning on doing this trip solo. I couldn't get anyone to go with me. So that was part of it too. So a lot of self-rescue practice when it was rough, when it was cold, when it was windy, just to make sure that, okay, I know I can pick up the pieces if I need to. Here's another problem I had. I had a bunch of gear to go out in the winter. I had 20 days of food every time I resupplied at a minimum, because I knew I might get stuck on a beach for a while in between towns. A lot of extra warm clothes, me. And I realized also that since it was solo, I didn't have anyone to split the load with. Pretty quickly, I realized, you know, so I thought about it for a while, and given all the factors, being by myself especially, and how much I had to carry, I got myself a big old Valley Etane. I got a plastic boat. I typically like to paddle a fiberglass or a wooden boat, but I just thought, I'm going to have to do some landings on some beaches and try to move this big heavy thing around myself, and I don't want to have to worry about scratching it up. That's just not going to be in the cards. So plastic seemed like the way to go.
Calvin,
go ahead.
Were you tethered to your boat?
Yes. If you look in the photo there, there's a purple line that runs from the bow back towards the cockpit. And I have another photo of that later, but I did tether myself, especially when I was out on the coast. I used it. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But yep, that was part of the extra layer, being by myself for sure. So, looking at this picture, you get a sense of like, okay, there's a lot to bring along. And this is just the gear. This is before you even get food involved. And there's a lot of details. So boy, the devil's in the details again. I went and packed my boat, I don't know, 5 or 6 times and tried to figure out how to make it fit, and then went back through the gear again. Okay, do I really need to bring this? Yes, I do. No, I don't. I mean, I got to the point of I took my rubber boots and cut the tops off of them so they were shorty rubber boots, because it just made it that much easier to pack them. So many iterations of going through again and again and again to be able to fit everything. And this is, plenty, but it's also just the gear. I also had to bring a whole bunch of food along with me. I thought about this a lot and really planned it out. I was making choices for having a lot of calories, a lot of fat. Butter was a good friend of mine on this trip. It came in useful. But even with this too, I also had to really consider volume and how to get it all in the boat. And so, I had a bag of walnuts so that I could have nuts in my oatmeal every morning. But it was down to the level and detail of thinking, okay, I'm going to get the bag of chopped walnuts instead of walnut halves, because for the same weight, it's about half the size. And so when you start thinking about those kinds of things, thinking about how to pull off a bigger, more remote trip, you really have to consider even those tiny details. They can end up making the difference between, okay, I can get everything in and this can work, or, ooh, I'm going to have a bag on the deck. And for me, knowing the kind of conditions I would be going into, it just didn't seem like that was an option. Every day, everything had to go back into this boat. And that was just really important. So there I was. I've been planning for a long time, but pretty soon it was January 1st. And it was time to get going. I chose to leave on New Year's Day from Orcas. Some of the local folks that we knew from Body Boat Blade, from classes and local friends, came down. And this was the one time on the trip that I had people help me carry my boat. And it was fantastic because the boat's fully loaded and they carried it right to the water for me. And I was off, kind of taking off from West Beach on Orcas Island. And day one was fantastic. It was sunny. There I am, looking so fresh and so ready. I have no idea what's going to happen. And I went over and paddled just a few miles to a little campsite on Stewart Island. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. I had actually never been to this island before. I camped there. And from that point on, every single place I went on the trip was brand new, completely undiscovered territory, seeing it all for the first time. And that was a pretty amazing feeling too. And it's something that I encourage people to do and go for, that just that feeling of discovery for yourself is pretty awesome when you're on a trip. The next day I crossed over into Canada, and I don't know if you've ever done a remote check-in for customs in Canada, but it looks like this. You open a box on the end of a dock and there's a phone that you can't even dial. And a nice fellow from somewhere over in Quebec says hello, and you tell him your passport number, and he doesn't believe you that you're in a 17-foot kayak, but you convince him. And then they have you write down your entry number, and you're off. And at this point, the expedition really started, because, okay, now it's time to be getting up super early. It started at 4:30 in the morning, every morning in the dark. There's so little daylight during this time of year. And so I had, my alarm go off, and it would usually take me about 3 hours from when the alarm went off until I could actually paddle away. So I had to do most of that in the dark. Eventually I got it down to more like 2.5 hours from an alarm to paddling away. I did get to see the sunrise and the gap between the clouds some days as I started off. And then pretty quickly it started being, 4 a.m. wake up, because the tide is shifting and I want to be able to catch those currents as I head out. But boy, the lack of daylight in January up north is really pronounced. This is a photo of high noon on one of the days during the trip. And it just really meant that I had to be paddling by 7:30 in the morning, and I was looking to land by 3:30 in the afternoon. It's just a very short window every day to actually do it. And I preferred to land earlier if I could, just because sometimes if the landing spot didn't work out, I wanted to have a buffer and have enough time to be able to get to the campsite. So I headed out around Victoria and into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. I could see Washington on the other side. I get glimpses of the Olympic Mountains occasionally across the strait, but most days it looked more like this. Not so many stunning mountain vistas. It is January after all, out on the coast. That percent cloud cover metric was true. I can verify. And often it even looked more like this. So it was interesting to be on the water and have it be very, very gray and very similar. It was actually incredibly challenging to navigate at times, because as you head up the coast of Vancouver Island, there's a series of points, but you can't necessarily tell them apart in the mist without any other markers along the way. But one thing that was interesting is that as I headed out, it was gray and it was rainy, but I was in a rainforest, and it was pretty amazing what I saw when I got on land every day. Just really big old growth trees, lush forests, just a ton of moss and life everywhere. And it was that time of year when it's just water, and everything's soaking it up, and just so green and so beautiful. And that was really amazing to see that environment too. There were other signs of the coast. This was at one campsite where it was a pretty sturdy hike up out of the campsite to get away from tsunami zone. And I thought, that's interesting. There were other things that really showed me that was on the coast too. This is a not great photo, a little blurry, but that whole rock and all those tan dots are stellar sea lions. And there were just hundreds of them, and you could hear them very far offshore, really making a racket. It was just amazing to see that many together in a colony in one place. And as I started getting out of the end of the strait, I started seeing this, just the first signs of there's some swell. And now I'm really getting out into the open coast. And eventually these little bits of swell turned into, a bit more. when you first get out onto the first stretch of coast in Vancouver Island, it's really pretty steep, dumpy beaches. Um, and I'm sure scenes like this, you all being from Oregon are quite familiar with, just lines of breakers and kind of looking out and trying to judge, oh, can I get out? Can I not? And so there were definitely some days where the weather might have been fair, but I remember one day in particular, I tried for an hour and a half to break out and get off the beach, and the ocean was telling me no. And I ended up getting capsized a couple of times, having to roll, having to surf in, sometimes thinking I was getting to the break and then getting just hammered back by that last big wall of water, nearly back to the beach. It's just, well, it's pretty demoralizing. So sometimes you just have to say, okay, I get it, and get back onto the beach and set up camp again and decide to stay. And you really get that sense of how big and powerful the ocean is when you're sitting there on the edge of it and wondering, like, okay, when can I move again? You get in a very real sense of how, yep, the sea is in charge here of the trip, and I have to just listen to the sea and to tell if I'm going to be able to move forward. There were stretches too that were quite remote in between towns, and saw a lot of wolf tracks and a lot of cougar tracks. Often, in this photo, there's some buoys in the background. That's where the campsite is, and there's this carcass. And I would come out and see fresh tracks in the morning, pretty close to where I'd been camping. And I was like, okay, well, these animals are around, and I just need to let them know I'm here, and make sure my food's stored away, and hopefully they'll go about doing what they're doing. And so that's just part of feeling like you're out there, is like, oh, it's a really remote and wild and a lot of stretches. There are also other things that were there. The rain, it was January on the coast in the rainforest. And it rained a ton on this trip. At one point, it rained 21 days in a row while I was on the west coast of the island. And it was a challenge to figure out how to deal with that, for sure. It's probably the question I got asked the most, was how in the world did you stay warm and dry? And really, that brings me to my third point when thinking about how to pull off a big, ambitious trip. And that is that systems will save you. I'm a big believer in building systems. And here's what I mean by that. So for me, this was me pretty much every day. Pretty happy, warm, dry, and well-fed and well-rested. And that is no accident. It takes a lot of little pieces. You need to have all systems built up. So for one was that I had a tarp, and I loved that tarp. I used it all the time, every day I camped, and you can see that it's set up over my tent. When I got to camp, I'd be a little damp from paddling, but the reality is it's already getting dark when you land, and it's probably 40 degrees or high 30s. And if you change your clothes, there is no way in the world that those clothes are going to dry. So what do? Well, I would add more layers to myself on top of the damp stuff and go about doing my chores. And then I'd go to sleep, and I would use my own body heat. Basically, synthetic fabrics are amazing, and push that moisture from the inside out. I had a synthetic sleeping bag and just dry out my clothes by wearing them every night. You do have to make sure that you kind of keep moving while you're setting up, and then make sure you're nice and toasty at night. But it works. You can be the clothes dryer, and then you wake up wearing, those clothes, and they're nice and dry and warm and ready for the day. And you still have a spare set that you haven't had to get wet. I'd mentioned my tarp before. I did make sure I really took the care to set up a nice sheltered place with kind of all the rainwater considered. I used to set up little bags around my tent, even so water couldn't splash up from when it rained really hard. And with that tarp, I also would keep it in a dry bag in front of my foot pegs. And then when I got to camp, it was the first thing that came out of the boat, and I would set it up immediately before I even opened my hatches. and then everything went straight from the hatches under the tarp to try to keep it as dry as possible. And then I would go under the tarp and then I would change or add layers or do whatever I needed to do. And then I'd set up camp. And then, that way I could even set up the tent underneath the tarp so that the tent didn't get wet as I was setting it up.
So Calvin, now that you're talking about all this water, there is a question about, what did you do for fresh drinking water?
The tarp was my friend again. Almost all my drinking water came off the corners of my tarp. I would set a pot out and as it rained, as it did so often, it would just drip into there. There were a couple times where I pulled water out of streams and then I purified it with a little bit of iodine or by boiling. But mostly I caught rainwater because it was raining so much. I always kept a big 10-liter dromedary behind my seat full as much as possible. And then I had some other water bottles and another little dromedary. So I did carry fresh water with me in case I got stuck somewhere where it wasn't raining for a couple of days or I didn't have access to a stream or fresh water. But I mean, this time of year, there's just streams coming off of the land everywhere. You couldn't paddle, 100 yards without finding another place where there was fresh water kind of coursing off the land, which is very different. This coast can be very dry in the summertime when they get into the kind of semi-permanent high pressure on the Pacific. So fresh water was never much of a problem. I was worried about it going into it, but I did not need to be worried about water at all. That worked out. Kind of on this theme of systems, I would also then do that whole setup in reverse in the morning where everything would come down, I'd get changed, I'd be under the tarp with all my gear, the boat would get packed, and then the last thing to go in would be the tarp. So I spent as much time protected from the elements as possible, and really found that just those little bits of extra, maybe not dry time, but less wet time helped a lot with keeping everything in good order and comfortable enough. And then, also it did get chilly. It got pretty frosty. It got snowed on a few times. And so I had to create some other systems where, in the morning I would make extra warm water and then I would pour it the last little bit into my booties to unfreeze them so I can put them on without my toes getting too cold as I was trying to get in the boat and get on the water before I really got cranking. And all those little things really, really added up. And so those are some of the things that I did for systems when I was on the land. But obviously, a lot of this trip, January on the west coast of Vancouver Island, there were plenty of challenges on the sea itself as well.
I am on my way to Tofino, and the name of the game today is Don't Go In There.
So again, this is something that you'll be familiar with. Swell coming into rock gardens. It can be a lot of fun. If you're in a completely fully loaded boat and you're trying to make a lot of miles, maybe not as much. One thing that's interesting about the coast on Vancouver Island is that it looks a lot like this in many places. There are just fields of rocks and reefs, and some partially submerged, some fully submerged, and all kinds of shallow depths interacting around the nooks and crannies of this island. And so a lot of my job every day when I was on the coast was trying to figure out, what line do I take? What makes the most sense? And that really depended on how big of a swell was coming in, because some days the best route would have looked like that, to tuck in behind a bunch of rocks. Some days it might have been to avoid the biggest stuff, but then sneak in a passageway. And some days when it was bigger, it might have just been to stay offshore completely. I spent a lot of time paddling 2 miles offshore and just really cruising around big features because the swell was just so big coming in. Typically, it'd be somewhere between 3, 4, 5 meters of swell. So just really, really sizable swells coming in. And as you all know, that means you're really trying to avoid these, the old boomer, which there were a lot of an awful lot of. But of course, when you're in your cockpit and you're on the water, it looks more like that. And it's just a little thing over on the horizon, and you don't really see it. And also, you don't see it all the time. So trying to figure that out becomes very important. I had mentioned this earlier, but I did, because I was solo, put this kind of purple line, it was webbing from the bow all the way back and then to the cockpit. And I had on my tow belt, I had an extra little pigtail that I would clip into that whenever I was in a place where there were potential for boomers, because I knew that if one snuck up on me and I miscalculated something and I got blown out of my boat, that I could be a mile offshore and out of my boat, and that was legitimately dangerous. And so that the most important thing I could think of was to be able to keep the boat attached to me so that I could at least get back to it and have a chance of a self-rescue after that event. It was kind of like my last resort in case of it. But what I did more than that was really carefully try to track where I was. This is what it says before every forecast on the radio. Let me give you a second to read that. Highest waves may be more than twice the forecast values. Wave heights vary considerably. And really, that was the most tricky part, the trickiest part. Because if you're looking at a chart here and you've got some rocks plotted, okay, very nice. And you've got some shallow spots, very nice. Say it's, 4 meters of swell the day that you're paddling. Okay, well, you could really reliably say, all those little rocks, I know there's going to be a boomer that goes off there. That deeper spot, it's probably going to stand up, or sorry, shallower spot over there on the right, it's probably going to stand up, but it might not break. Except that when you get that big set wave that comes through every so often, and all of a sudden there's a 7-meter wave, it's going to set that off. And so I really had to be cognizant of what is going on the chart and where am I in relation to all of that. So as you're bobbing up and down in these big swells, you get up to the top and you have to do a quick look around, kind of like a prairie dog, looking all around, and take notice of everything that you can. Sometimes you see either a boomer going off, or you see the signs of it with some foam in the water in the middle of a place of water. Some of these would only go off every 10 minutes. So you had to really try to look far ahead, notice everything you could, and kind of keep track of it in your head. At the same time, there's a lot of places on the coast there where there's actually a significant amount of current. And so you're kind of on this conveyor belt moving in whatever direction the current is, which may or may not be in the direction that you're paddling. And you have to keep track of that sideways motion, as well as all the boomers going off. And really what it made me realize is that, boy, you really have to be on with your navigation. And I really focused on that. You have to be sure where you are, you have to be sure where the environment is pushing you and how that energy is working to get you different places. I really learned to trust ranges out in the world, looking at lining up rocks and cliffs and points and all kinds of things. And I really learned to trust my wristwatch. A lot of other things when you're out in this environment, it's hard to judge. Have I paddled a half a mile? How long have I been paddling? What's happening right now? Am I to the east of this rock, or am I still to the southeast of it? And really, I found again and again that my own guess was wrong. But when I would actually take a measurement, or I would actually look at my watch, that would tell me the real story. That was really important. People often ask if I had a GPS on the trip. I did, and I never used it. I really needed to be able to have that big picture of what was going on with all of the rocks and all of the, these massive areas I was trying to go across in a day. And I could do that with a big chart case on my deck, but I couldn't quite do that with the GPS. Also, I was very aware of how cold and how wet it was, and I didn't want to risk being reliant on an electronic device that would stop working. So it was just chart, grease pencil, compass, and watch, and that was my primary system for navigation throughout the trip. So swell, boomers, one big consideration. Another one though is it is the winter time and it gets windy, really, really windy on the coast. I got pretty used to listening to the radio, and if it said that it was a small craft advisory, I was definitely paddling. And if it was a gale warning, maybe I'd have to kind of take a look. Storm warning, okay, not paddling. And so that's your kind of your 15, 25, 35 knot ranges there. It was constantly windy, and also I was constantly out of cell service. And so, we are so fortunate to have these kinds of tools where you can go on before a day's paddle and look at fine granularity of how much wind is there and what's going on in these different areas. What should I expect? But the truth is, most days when I woke up, I only had the VHF to listen to and hear what was going to be happening in the area. And so I took a sheet, one of these sheets with me, and I laminated it. And I would sit there and the night before, and then again in the morning before I paddled, and listen to the most current forecast. And I would draw in everything that I was hearing in terms of the different lighthouse stations, what they were observing, where the fronts were, where all the pressure systems were moving, how much speed there was in different places. And I'd have to try to construct on this sheet and in my head how the weather systems were moving and how I could reasonably expect it to change throughout the day. And so this is why I was so glad that I'd really studied up on meteorology and learned about how these things tend to work, so I could make good predictions about what the rest of my day would look like and make safe calls for should I get off the water or not. Because the weather just comes in quickly there. And sometimes you get windows of just a few hours where it's like, okay, I can paddle for a few hours. I want to make some progress. But I know that when I see this next line coming in, it's going to get really windy again. And I need to be off the water before it arrives. As you head up the coast, there's kind of three main crux points, three big peninsulas that you have to get around. And those are all very remote. Again, these are places where there is no cell service and you really have to use the best information you can get from the VHF and from watching the environment around you. Before I got to the first one, Estevan Point, I pulled into a place called Hot Springs Cove. And, I heard the wind come up overnight and the forecast said that a big system was moving in. And so I was like, okay, we'll see how this looks in the morning. And when I woke up in the morning, this is what it looked like. And I was like, that's interesting. And I went over and talked to these fishermen. I was like, hey guys, what's going on? They're like, it's too big out there for us. And I was thinking, okay, well, if it's too big for a 70-foot fishing trawler and they need shelter, I'm probably going to be here for a while. And I walked out to the point to take a look. And this was the small day. And, it just grew from there. We had talked before about how wave heights can be up to twice the forecast value. One night, I was looking at this forecast. I have always found this humorous where I remember hearing it on the radio, seas subsiding to 9 meters. Like, oh my goodness. Also, 50 knots of wind. So easy decision. I'm not paddling tomorrow. It's looking like this. This is the protection of the cove. When swells get really big, they can also get pretty long periods. So this is kind of like a wait for it. So the storm was huge and it lasted for days. Just kind of hurricane force winds over 50 knots blowing for a few days. At Tofino and the offshore buoys, they actually had some record-breaking wave heights on the offshore buoys. They said that they measured waves that were over 60 feet in height, which is incredible. It started to calm down a little after a couple of days and fishermen left, but I think you can get a sense that this is again leaving the cove, and that's our new foot boat is still getting bounced around pretty good. So, you have to make the right call. And I think that waiting is a skill. When you're on an expedition, you have to be willing to wait and be content while you do it. You read, you write in your journal, you eat, you sleep as much as you can, maybe you play a game of solitaire, whatever you need to do, just to pass the time and until it's the right time to go, even if it's multiple days. Can I travel on this day? Nope. Still looking like that after a few days, which is pretty incredible. So day to day, I'm kind of constantly looking to do a risk assessment. And this is really key on these long trips. So, okay, I have to decide, is it safe? I have to look at all the different factors, the wind, the swell height, the weather, how tired I am, what direction currents are heading or what direction wind is heading, and try to put it all together and decide, can I travel? And sometimes it comes down to, you got to travel when you can. It started clearing up a little here at Hot Springs. It had been 6 nights and 5 days that I spent there waiting out the storm. And, it's like, well, the weather's clearing up. The wind has really died down. It's going to get super windy again tomorrow for several days. So this might be my chance to go. But it's going to be a long stretch. And so again, you have to really think about risk assessment. So this is my paddle that I was looking at, going from Hot Springs up to the beginning of Nootka Sound. This is over 30 nautical miles. And yes, I had clear skies and some sun, and the wind had really died down. I think it was like 10. It was this calm day in the middle of craziness, but it was still 4.5 meters out at the buoy. So just really big swells. And I knew from talking to people that there weren't any good landing spots pretty much along this whole peninsula. It's very rocky, especially not in that kind of swell. So I had to think, well, this might be my chance and I think I can do it, but I'm just not going to land. And so this was a 9.5 hour day, no breaks in the boat the whole time. I mean, I took breaks to snack, I took breaks to pee, but I couldn't land for that whole time. And to be honest, the waves were huge because you did get those set swells that were still coming through, and there was still a big system offshore driving more and more in. And I saw some really big wave heights, and it was pretty scary at times. This was probably the hardest day of the whole trip for me. Just not being able to take a break, and also getting pretty close to that line of like, ooh, is it gonna break, and then force me all the way into shore, into the rocks. So I did a lot of navigating far offshore, a lot of just paddling as well as I could. And by the end of the day, I was pretty beat. I remember coming into the opening to Nootka Sound and realizing that the prediction for the ebb tide there, which just flows out of the bay pretty strongly, was wrong, and that the ebb had already started, and I had already paddled all these miles, and I had this current very clearly rushing against me, and it was really hard. And it was pretty demoralizing. And that's kind of where the last part of this whole day really taught me my last thing, which is, being positive. And in some ways, I don't know if that's so helpful, because what does be positive mean? That's kind of, general. So for an expedition, I would say it's more about being encouraging, saying nice things to each other. And to be honest, I was by myself. So I said nice things to myself when I was on this crazy day and trying to get around this. If all of a sudden I was like, oh no, I need to get outside, I would point outside and start paddling as hard as I could. and just go like, hey, you're doing great. Keep going, keep going, keep going. And it really made a difference. At the end of that day, when I was so tired, I was just telling myself, hey, you've made it this far already. It's okay. You've got this current ahead of you, but you've got these big swells behind you. So wait for the right ones and surf them. And because of the current coming against it, the swells were peaking up enough that I could surf them in. And so that last stretch for the last couple miles ended up being just surfing down swell against current and finally getting in where I could cut into an eddy and get into a little bay, and then get off the water. And I was so glad to get off the water that day. It was incredibly hard. And there were other days like that on the trip that were really hard. But the truth about going on a big, long expedition is that most of the time, the challenges are more mundane. More like, this is the daily grind on an expedition when you're by yourself. That boat is incredibly heavy. And you have to move it to the beach. So sometimes the challenge is just that the ocean is so far away. In this picture, you can see that my boat is way down there. And you have to load and unload it, and you have to go through the soft stuff, and you have to figure out how to get it in and out of the water safely. In that, little clip I was trying to do it, it's slow, but boy, you have to save your back because you're the only one out there. And that's a lot of going on these expeditions, is doing 100 little things every day to keep yourself safe and sturdy and ready for the next day, and making choices. Again, a ton of little choices constantly to be able to do that. It's not sexy, it's not a gripping narrative, but really, when I think back on that trip, most of what I think about is how, day to day, little tiny challenges, little tiny things I had to do all the time. There were those big challenges as I went, obviously those happened too. Looking at the next one, the Brooks Peninsula, it's this huge mountain range, and you just see these, beaches smoking as all the wave energy is hitting it and all this moisture is getting released into the air. And, I had to wait to get around places again. And I kind of do my risk assessment and get ready and then go for it again. This is me after getting around the Brooks. And you can tell how intense it had been. This is several hours after daylight, and I'm still wearing my headlamp. I think that's a good indication of just what it was. Going down the face of the Brooks, I went 7 nautical miles in 50 minutes with current and wind behind me and downwind run surfing in a fully loaded kayak. I don't know if I've ever moved that fast on the ocean before. They're just huge forces at play, and you really have to be understanding what's happening with them and being able to ride along with them as you go. But looking back after days like that, and this is looking back on the Brooks, it was just such an amazing feeling of accomplishment. And I knew that I could do it. I climbed up on the bluff at the end of the day and listened to the VHF radio. And then all of a sudden, these wolves started howling. And they were so close. I mean, it's that kind of feeling like if you hear someone's dog barking and it's right in your neighbor's yard. It was like that. They were howling, and I was like, there's a wolf right there. And then another one howls, like, there's a wolf right there. I was like, okay, well, I guess I have wolves to hang out with tonight. And I remember talking to myself a lot while making dinner. And I even put a little music on my phone at one point while I was kind of settling into the tent for the night, just letting them know, like, hey, wolves, I'm here. Just to let you know. It's the best I could do so you don't get surprised. But in the morning, there was a lot of tracks around my boat and a lot of tracks on the beach, but they left me alone. But that kind of feeling of being so far out there and so close to these big forces, whether it's a wolf or the swell or the wind or these remote places, it's really kind of like living in a dream state. And that's what I do like about going on these longer trips, where at some point it just feels like this is just all I've ever done. And what I do is I get up and I get in my kayak, and you kind of launch out into the gray each morning. And it's kind of mystical, and sometimes you don't have any visibility, but you can sneak up on sea otters, and they don't even notice you're there until you get right up next to them. They're just taking a nap, doing their thing in the swell. I kept heading north, made it finally to Cape Scott, and made it around probably the least epic of the days. And then you find these landscapes that are just like alien. You're like, what is this doing here? There's sand dunes. And it just doesn't seem, it's hard to comprehend, like, what's going on. Someone had told me, like, it's well worth your time. Make sure you hike up to the lighthouse when you're at Cape Scott. So it's a mile and a half or so. I dutifully hiked up and I climbed at the lighthouse and had this view because it's January, or it was February at this point, in the Pacific. But that was okay. I think this picture pretty well describes me at this point in the trip. I'm beat physically. I'm so tired, but I'm also feeling really energized in a way that doesn't happen in day-to-day life. And I feel like those places that you can get to is where the real magic happens, where you every moment can just feel like you're part of the surroundings. You get incredible delight out of just finding something colorful or beautiful that pops out. And sometimes you just get a wonderful surprise that you didn't expect as you go along. Sometimes you find something much bigger than you. As I came around down the inside passage, the heron run was happening, and I started seeing sea lions by the hundreds that were out there to eat.
I think you can see them back there. They're just following me. Oh.
I had on multiple days a lot of sea lions follow me, and sometimes they were just kind of curious, and sometimes they were growling at me the whole time. And it's like, well, hey, I'm gonna just keep paddling. And there's those marine protection laws that say you need to be 200 yards from these large mammals, and it was just impossible. They were everywhere out in these channels, and there was no path to take where you could possibly be away from them. So just kind of try to avoid them and keep paddling. And they mostly just want you out of their territory, and I didn't have any problems with them. As I came down the inside, challenges changed again. Really, it became a bit of a sufferfest. What I had not anticipated when I planned the trip, I hadn't looked this far ahead, and I wish I had. Well, maybe I don't wish I had, but basically there isn't a flood tide in Johnstone Strait this time of year. It's just ebb, and those the directions of the tide going against me as I was coming down. There's also an awful lot of those headwinds, and I had switched directions, so I didn't have tailwinds anymore. I mostly had headwinds. So I had tide coming against me and headwinds coming against me, and just endless, beautiful strait to keep paddling and keep paddling and keep paddling. At this point, because I didn't have the big swells to worry about, I did start doing some night paddles. I wanted to get some more mileage in when the weather was fair. But that took its toll as well, doing these big 30 and 40 nautical mile days consistently, where my hands were just getting shredded. I cycled between pogies and mittens, trying to, shift the damage from one part of my hand to another. But in the end, it just ended up, this is round 3 of blisters, I think, on the inside as I was coming down. And it was just cold water and paddling that much every day. There's not a ton you can do about it. As I came down, I started seeing civilization. Campbell Rivers was the big one where I was like, oh, there's a lot of people here now, and started seeing more docks and boats and infrastructure. And then this is on day 46. It might be my favorite picture of the trip. It's not a very good photo, but it's the first time that I saw Orcas Island in the distance again. I was like, I recognize that mountain. Wow, that's home. And I kept paddling. And then the next day I was looking at the beach that I had left from, and I landed, and I had made it in 47 days. And it was pretty amazing. Some friends met me and gave me some bubbly, and wow, what a trip. And this is something that I think I really encourage people. Maybe it's not a month and a half long expedition, but there's probably something something that you really want to do, whether it's paddling or otherwise, that you're not quite sure if you're going to be able to accomplish. And I just think that it's really worth looking into the details and finding solutions and, you know, really building some systems and going for it. Because, you know, whether or not you're able to set out to do what you do, my guess is you won't regret trying. And I certainly didn't on this trip. And I don't think I would have, even if I had gotten turned back. It was pretty amazing. So anyway, that's a little presentation about my trip. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm gonna turn my screen share off here.